So we're going to now take a look here at one of the ways in which uh, N.T. Wright tries to demonstrate his hermeneutical approach when dealing with instructions or teachings found within the Bible. So he decides to take as one of these illustrations the command to Israel to keep the Sabbath. So here I'm just going to kind of lay out a few things. First of all, about the Sabbath in general, and then how the Sabbath is understood in the Old Testament. And then in another podcast, I will talk about how Wright sees Sabbath understood in the teaching of the New Testament. So the command to Israel to remember the Sabbath and to keep it holy, sometimes kind of known as the fourth commandment out of the Ten Commandments, is found in both Exodus 28 and in Deuteronomy chapter 5, 12 through 15. So that's the basic commandment teaching that Israel must keep a one day out of the week um, distinct. So, in other words, holy, unique, special, in a sense, sacred, as a day that is different than the other days. This commandment was very unique in the ancient world. It was certainly a source of conflict for Jews living in the first century, or living around um, non-Jews who basically did not do this thing. I mean, there were certainly sacred days that were observed by Gentiles, days to recognize the gods, but no other people had one day every week that was set aside to recognize, to worship, to celebrate their God. And so the frequency of this particular activity by Jews made them unique in the world. So it is rooted, as Wright states on page 143, in two of Israel's greatest narratives, which really helped to shape Israel's identity or Jewish identity. So the idea of creation and the idea of Exodus. And why these two narratives, the narrative of God creating, is so important for Israel is in the ancient world, there were, people had many different gods, and many different gods were responsible for many different parts of creation. So you can have a god of particular areas. So ancient people could have a concept where, this is our God who is concerned with, creating and sustaining us in this area, or these gods operate over this part of the world. But Israel was making the claim that the God that they honor and worship is not just responsible for the land in which they live in, but he is responsible for the creation of the entirety of the world, the entire cosmos. Everything that is created owes its existence to the God that Israel worships. And also, the Exodus is a pivotal moment in terms of of seeing a God who is going to be faithful to his promise to Abraham to create a nation um, from his descendants. And so, as the descendants of Abraham who are living in Egypt are brought out of Egypt and brought to a land and constitutes a people living in a land, in other words, taking possession of a land, is seen as part of this fulfillment of God's promise to them that he would relate to them in that particular land, in that area. So the world itself, in one sense, is, or all of creation is, one sense, sacred as the thing which God has created. And the people who come out of Egypt and are given this land by God to dwell are also, in a sense, sacred. Not only the people, but the land in which they live in is considered sacred. So the Sabbath observance is, is something that is done in recognition of these two great narratives that help to define who the people of Israel are and the God that they worship. So, with several other things we can point out about this, so Sabbath in the Old Testament. So, Sabbath observance is seen as a recognition that God created the world to function orderly. The world was, in one sense, null and void, as a kind of world of chaos before God then sets it in order. And so, in the story of Genesis, there are these days, and these different days, God, creates, brings into existence things. Now, as a side note, we can probably see that the creation account in Genesis is intended to be poetic. It is set up as poetry. And so this is kind of like a hymn or poetic creation in order to celebrate God and his creation over of all things, that all things owes his existence to him. And so the fact that God stops creating on one day, or he stops this process on one day, is then going to be celebrated by those that recognize that everything has come about in accordance to an order that God has. So, since God is the creator, he is also sovereign over the things that he creates. And therefore, those things that he creates serve him. And so they serve him. They serve him by maintaining or staying within the order that he has created. So Sabbath observance calls Israel back to the recognition uh, to recognize this world as an orderly place. The world is also God's dwelling place. So this is something that Wright will point out is the language that is used in both God's creation seems to echo themes of temple language, and that in a sense the world is created as a place for God to dwell. I mean, Jews understood that God doesn't, actually live on earth, and you understand the heaven is God's domain, as this other dimension in which God lives in. God doesn't live in creation; He is outside of it. But He can create this place in which He can operate. So we get the language of God walking in the garden as this again poetic way of talking about God dwelling with Adam and Eve. And so Sabbath observance is a recognition not only that God created it, that he sustains it, that he ordered it, but that he also dwells among us. So he's not a God who is detached. He's not like an Aristotle's God of the unmoved mover that doesn't even know we exist. That creation somehow spawns off of his existence. Um, God interacts with creation. And so by observing the Sabbath, we're recalling, or Israel is recalling, that interaction. So Israel also maintains God's favor by observing this commandment. You can see in Isaiah 56 where this is kind of indicated. So when Israel doesn't observe this Sabbath, they are communicating something. They are saying we no longer need to recognize God's as sovereign over creation or God's interaction with creation. So it is in a sense, not to observe the Sabbath is to forget that relationship that God has with creation. So Sabbath keeping in the Old Testament prophetic tradition then indicate that creation and God's people are also headed somewhere. It's not just that by keeping the Sabbath, Israel looks back at what God does, and it's not that they just as well are reminded of God's present activity within the world, but also that God is taking the world somewhere. And partly because there's another narrative that's at work, and that narrative is the fall. So, because the world through sin became broken, and sin and death entered in, and human beings have to live with terrible tragedies, and they live with behaviors that are destructive, and that this is not, the world is not existing currently as God intended it, but that God is going to take the world somewhere. And Sabbath observance is a reminder that because He is sovereign, He is also moving creation towards a particular destination. So it's this interaction between sacred time, the Sabbath, and sacred space, that is this space in which we live and operate in our lives. So the people of Israel, that where God dwells amongst, sacred space. One last kind of slide here about Sabbath in the Old Testament, as it's explained by Wright, is noting that Israel's festivals, such as Passover, again, that recalls the Exodus story, contain great Sabbaths. And great Sabbaths not only recall God's action in the past, deliverance, but anticipate God's renewal of creation in the future. So, um, for Israelites, particularly, let's say in the first century, in Jesus' day, when they are remembering or celebrating that God had delivered them out of the hands of an oppressive pagan ruler, or Gentile ruler, it is that God is going to do it again. And he, in the Passover, he brought them to a land, fulfilling his promise to Abraham. And the day is going to come when Israel again will possess the land and be blessed as God had promised Abraham he would bless his descendants. So, what is also renewed in the future is God's justice. So, Sabbath observance is then a sign of God's concern for the poor. So, even the poor rest, slaves rest, animals rest, land rest. And so, it is this idea that it is just for there to be this rest, um, this release, as it were, from labor. Labor is an aspect of the fall. To be released from that labor is then to experience something of God's justice. So Sabbath observance is an anticipation of God's future justice when God kind of returns and God delivers, He saves His people. And there was also in the law, in Leviticus 25, the concept of Jubilee, a kind of sabbatical year. The sabbatical year is taken every 49th year. So 7 times 7, 49. And this Jubilee year is supposed to bring about freedom and economic restitution. So, if you became enslaved because you had debt, you were to be freed. And if you had land that was taken away from you because it was used as collateral for loans, that land was returned to you. And so it's kind of a reset button. So any debts were forgiven, and people can then begin to live within prosperity. So every 49 years, this happened. And so that is a sabbatical year. It is a rest. It is a getting back to God's justice, getting back to God's created order that God is eventually going to bring about. Now, of course, in the Old Testament, there is not, well, in much of the Old Testament, at least in the Deuteromistic material and the wisdom material, there's not really much of an eschatological activity of God, where we're living in the present age, and that present age is going to end, and we're going to have this age to come. That really comes about in the apocalyptic material of Israel's tradition, which comes a little bit later. But Right now, it's this idea that, every 7 years, you're going to be reminded, everybody, for an entire year, not just one day, but the kind of world that God wants people to live in, where they're not being oppressed, where they're not being enslaved, where they're not, uh, you know, being indebted to others, where they can live off the land and live in ways that are prosperous from the land. So generally, the point that can be made, well, we can get into a lot more of the details. You'll read that when you read this section of Wright, is observing the Sabbath is an exercise of faith for Israel, a faith in God to keep his promises. His promises to Abraham, his promises to Moses and to the people who live in covenant relationship with him. And so, not to observe the Sabbath is in a sense, a declaration of not having faith in God to do what God said he would do. So for a Jew to not observe the Sabbath would be seen as um, a major statement of disbelief in God, and that's why it became a very important commandment to emphasize, especially for Jews who became surrounded, as it were, by Gentiles and who were actually living under Gentile governments. Why it became very important for them to emphasize this, that even though currently they're living under somebody else's authority over the land, they believe God is going to restore the land back to them, and they can live their lives no longer indebted to some other powers or indebted to some other peoples, but instead could live off of the land as God had intended his people, his unique people, to do. So that's a kind of a brief overview of how Wright thinks about Sabbath in the Old Testament and its functions. We'll get into another podcast then about how he sees this playing out in the New Testament, and then raising the question of, so what do Christians today, what do we do about Sabbath observance? Do Christians have to observe the Sabbath? How do we treat the laws of the Sabbath for believers today?